been jabbed in by McGoldrick. Tottenham's lead short-lived. Well, the check has gone on for over 3 minutes, and that surely is unacceptable. Still going. Protractor out, everything out. Oh no! This is harsh. This is the harshest of harsh calls.
The most difficult thing that people have contested is the offside rules. The offside by a margin of a fraction of centimeters. There is room to change a little bit the offside rule. You're not offside as long as any part of your body you can score with is on line with the defender, and not anymore you're offside if any part of your body is in front of a defender.
Last week, Arsene Wenger offered his own solution to the offside rule problem that has plagued the Premier League since the introduction of VAR. But in so doing, he implied that FIFA have decided to rewrite the laws of the game to suit the age of technology refereeing. In this episode, we ask, how do Wenger's modifications of the offside rule fit in with the long history of the laws of the game?
In principle, I don't like talking about decisions, referees, and refereeing. I think it's boring. I think football is really interesting.
Jack Pitt-Brooke covers Tottenham Hotspur in England for The Athletic and hosts their View from the Lane podcast.
Nothing more annoying than when you're watching Match of the Day or a live game on TV and their analysis of the game is, was it or wasn't a foul? Was it or wasn't a red card or a penalty or whatever? Just because, football is really fun and watching great players do great things, watching great teams play in certain ways is really, really exciting. And so I always feel like, well, I kind of don't care whether it was a red card or not. It might have been, or maybe it wasn't, but why don't we just talk about Kevin De Bruyne or Liverpool's pressing or why are West Ham so bad? There's so much interesting stuff, and what annoys me is how arguing about referees and decisions has basically substituted in for time that could be spent talking about football.
So there was a news story that broke last week you covered in your Athletic piece. Arsene Wenger, fresh into his new job as FIFA's head of global development, announced that he wanted to tweak the offside law. Could you talk us a little bit through his proposal?
Yeah, so Wenger's come up with what I think is a well-meaning but ultimately flawed proposal to change offside, which I think ultimately is a reaction to the current problem with VAR offsides. And that is, instead of the relevant part of an attacker's body being his furthest forward legally usable body part, which in practice is usually the chest or armpit. I mean, traditionally we would never have to make these distinctions because traditionally in offside people would be assumed to be standing straight. But now, given VAR, it's generally the head or armpit of a player, which is his furthest forward part. That is the bit which is offside. Now, the Wenger plan is to change that from being the furthest back part of the attacker, which in practice would generally be the back of his heel or his back leg, given that he's running forward. And by doing so, it would radically rebalance football in favour of the attacker, because, you can have your back heel level with the defender, but most of the rest of your body and all your momentum is in front of him and therefore or her, and therefore situations which are currently offside would be rendered onside under this new rule. And I don't think it would lead to fewer offside calls as such, but things which are currently offside would be onside, basically. Wenger's argument for this, which I think is where it falls down in part, is that it would stop what he called calls of millimetres, which is obviously people's issue with VAR at the moment.
In your piece, you talk about the unintended consequences of the rule change. What do you think the unintended consequences of this new offside rule would be?
Well, I think the first one is that it would be really, really hard to tell who was offside or not. because assistant referees at any level have spent their whole career looking more or less at eye level, identifying players' heads, players' chests, which are all easy to tell apart one from the other. When you look down and you're looking at players' boots, it's much harder to tell who's a who's, but especially if, it sounds like a joke, but it isn't, particularly if they're all wearing the same colour of boot. Imagine if you're in a normal linesman's position. Let's say it's an attacking free kick from out wide, and you've got 5 attackers and 5 defenders, roughly in a line, and one of them, goes on to score a goal. You have to tell which boots belong to that particular player through a big forest of legs. It's really, really hard to do practically. That, I think, would be the first and main unintended consequence, would be the difficulty of actually assessing who is and isn't offside without VAR technology.
If every supposed solution must have an implied problem that it is overcoming, what would you say that the problem is that Wenger thinks he's actually solving?
I think Wenger thinks he's solving the problem, which is that VAR is giving too many offside calls, as in too many people are being ruled to be offside through the VAR process. And also the VAR process, as a fan, it's annoying when 2 players who are level, who look level, and are kind of understood to be level, suddenly you're told after kind of a 1 minute stoppage, actually, that particular player was in fact offside. And you think, well, that runs up against my understanding of the game. My kind of reaction to that is, well, if you look at the stats, offside calls in the Premier League are lower than ever. There has been a very, very steady and clear decrease in offsides for years. This is spelled out in a piece that I've done for The Athletic. To me, that says that even though these offside calls are annoying, there are not so many of them that we need to rewrite the laws. I think the laws are actually fine. It's just the VAR process that we don't like.
Would you have your own alternative solution to that problem?
Personally, I think the rules are fine. I think the offside law is fine. I think it works. People understand it. The problem is its interaction with the technology. Because once the Premier League start using the technology to try and make these ludicrously microscopic distinctions between players, that is what has caused the problem. 2 years ago, nobody would say there was a problem really with the offside law in the Premier League. It was fine. So I think the solution, if the problem is technological, the solution has to be technological. And if that means, I think we have to change how we use VAR to police offsides. If we rip up the offside law, we're trying to solve the wrong problem.
It seems that the introduction of VAR has cast the rules of the game under the kind of scrutiny that they were never designed to face.
Sport is basically to win by respecting the rules. If there's no respect for the rules, it's not real sport. So that's what I think is the most important.
There seems to be 2 potential solutions here, either to reformulate the rules in the age of technology or to remove technology from the adjudication of the game altogether. Is Wenger's approach here an indication that FIFA have decided to take the former route and reformulate the rules?
Yeah, I think it probably is. I don't think that... look, we should say that this is just a suggestion. It hasn't passed IFAB yet. I think it's actually, when it first came out, there was a suggestion it was going to be rushed through before the Euros. That isn't going to be the case. So this isn't part of the laws of football yet. I think you're probably right. I think that the rules will be changed, which I think is wrong, because I think the rules are fine. The issue is how VAR has basically showed up inconsistencies in the laws, or VAR has kind of asked new questions of the laws, which, as you say, they're not designed to face. But I don't think you should blame the laws for that. I think you should blame VAR.
In your piece, you mentioned that Arsene Wenger responded robustly to Marco van Basten's suggestion 3 years ago that the offside rule should be removed altogether. He claimed, and I quote, "Offside is what makes the team good together. It is an intelligent rule as well. It is important to keep that in the game. Changing in itself is not a quality. Improving is a real target." To what extent do you think that the tactical importance of the offside rule has been forgotten in all of this conversation about the millimetres that have obviously started determining what an offside is or isn't?
The offside law is obviously incredibly important to how football on the pitch is arranged, basically. So this is something that Jonathan Wilson's written about at length. I think he's absolutely right. The offside law is responsible for basically forming the effective playing area on the pitch. If we didn't have it, then the game would... we actually don't know, and it would be kind of interesting to see, but I'm sure the game would be massively stretched out across the pitch. It would come down far more to athletic ball carrying, hoofing it up the pitch and chasing it. Whereas if you have a very clearly defined playing area, as in one back four to the other back four, then that really concentrates minds and kind of organises the play in the middle. And that's why the Van Basten quote was so strange when it came out, because it was so, like, how could you play football to such a high level your whole life and spend your whole life thinking about football and then not realise that if you were to remove offside, it would be like sticking a pin in a balloon, like the whole thing would just collapse.
Much of the recent discussion about the offside rule is focused on the present context in which the rule is used. But the law itself has a long history which goes back to the 19th century. In order to better situate the current debates, it seems timely to explore that history to offer a more comprehensive framework within which to assess it. So the earliest iteration of the offside rule appears in football in the 1860s, and it's a lot more similar to, I think, the rugby offside rule as it is now.
Yeah, so the initial 1863 law said, when a player has kicked the ball, anyone of the same side who is nearer to the opponent's goal line is out of play and may not touch the ball himself, nor in any way whatever prevent any other player from doing so until he is in play. So that basically meant that you couldn't, like in rugby, you effectively couldn't pass to somebody stood in front of you. So it was all about, if you were to kick it forward, one of your teammates had to chase from behind you, which meant that you couldn't, like, precisely build attacks in the way that we're now familiar with.
I guess the problem then comes that there's a form of football being played in Scotland where that offside rule isn't used. And so the game develops in a completely different way where passing is a possibility.
Yeah, so seemingly it was when English teams played against Scottish teams, and Scottish teams obviously, having played to a different set of laws, had learnt to play the game in a completely different way. And then the English teams were exposed as being incredibly, like, medieval, basically, in how they understood football. It's always really interesting, these topics where differences in rules affect differences in play. Clearly this was an area where England's old-fashioned rule had produced a very old-fashioned game, and it's only, I think, when they realised the superiority of the Scottish system that the English laws were brought up to speed.
Obviously, with the introduction of this notion of that football was going to be a game in which passing was a thing, you need to start having rules which legalise the unfair passing beyond the back four, as you said before, into space, so that you can't just have people standing in what we now call offside positions, just benefiting from standing right near the keeper and evading the tactical structure of the game. So I guess it was only a matter of time before something like the modern offside rule was needed at this point.
Yeah, so in 1866, the rule said that you had to have 3 defensive players between the goal and the point at which the ball is kicked, and that basically formed the sort of football in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras before the next big change in the early 20th century.
And that change is accelerated by the fact that there comes a point in the 1920s where football teams become so adept at defending that it almost becomes impossible to score.
Yeah, so the key person here is Bill McCracken, who I think was Irish and played for Newcastle United. And obviously, because of the offside law, Newcastle would leave McCracken basically playing in front of the goalkeeper, and the other centre-back, I think Frank Hudspeth, would step up. And that meant that anybody between Hudspeth and McCracken would be offside. And obviously, given that Newcastle would have the goalkeeper and McCracken back to protect themselves against any attackers who managed to break through, they would almost never concede. And it was seen as a bit of a scandal, I think, in the early 20s, just how good defensively Newcastle were. And they would get booed around the country wherever they went. And that was when the lawmakers decided that, in fact, it was unfair to always, forgot what it was known, it was called like the one-man back defence, or there was some kind of name they had in the 1920s for this. And it was so unpopular, just how good Newcastle were defensively, that they decided they had to change the laws in order to prevent this and to make more goals in football.
And so that's the point at which they then say rather than 3 defensive players, it's 2 defensive players.
At its most basic, to be onside, the current offside law, to be onside, when the ball is played by a teammate, an attacker must have at least 2 opposition players between themselves and the goal. Mm-hmm. So when the ball is played, the attacker must have at least 2 opposition players between themselves and the goal. Mm-hmm.
So now we're getting to a point where the offside rule's impact on the game should be becoming clearer, because you're seeing constant tweakings of the rules so that you're making the game flow better, but also be a more attractive proposition for people watching it. Since the 1920s, there's been some further changes to the offside rule, but these seem to follow the principle that the rule should allow space whilst giving benefit to the attacking players. Can you tell us about how the 2005 offside rule fits in with these principles?
Yes, there's 2 things. One is to do with the precise definition of level, and this is what Wenger has suggested changing. It's only legally usable parts of you can be judged to be offside. So if an attacker, for example, is running and has got his arm outstretched as he runs forward, the arm can be in an offside position, but that doesn't matter because you can't score a goal with your arm, and therefore it's effectively the player's core and his legs and his head which are judged instead. So that makes it easier as an attacker, I think, to make those runs and not be judged to be offside. The other is to do with interfering. So we've seen that the definition of interfering has effectively been narrowed in such a way as to allow lots of other forward activity in an offside position. So now you get, and I think teams don't really exploit this enough, but an attacker can be in an offside position when a pass comes in, but the pass goes to a different attacking teammate. Then if he takes a step back, either behind the ball or behind another defender who's recovered, he can be legally onside for the next phase, as in the next pass, even if he'd been offside for the first phase. And that means that attackers are not obliged to run back onside. They're not killing their team's moves simply by being offside in the first phase of play when the pass is made to a different player on his own team. So by doing that, I think what we've seen in the last few years is that it's harder for teams to catch offside. I think in most games there is less stepping up to catch the other team offside. There's less offside trap, and that's one of the main factors as to why the number of offsides has massively decreased. Not the only factor, but why offside has massively decreased over the last 20 or so years.
So this brings us to the present day. How would you say your assessment of Wenger's proposed rule change fits into the history of the law since the beginning of the game? Is Wenger's attempt to tweak the rule consistent with the history of that rule?
Yeah, I do think it is consistent in the sense that he's identified a problem in the flow of the game or in how the game is played, which in his mind is too many people being offside. And he thinks that if we change the law, we can improve the game. Now, I disagree with his analysis, but I am sympathetic to his intentions. Not least because, everything else being equal, law changes which benefit attacking players are good. Within reason, we all want to see more goals, more attacking football, fewer offsides, I think. So I totally think it's consistent with, for example, the changes of the 1860s or the 1920s or more recently. I just happen to think that he's got his diagnosis wrong.
It seems as though undercutting all of this discussion is the notion of VAR and how it's changing our views of how the sport should be adjudicated, how the process of legalisation should work in football. Do you think that we're going to start seeing a new era of rules in the age of technology refereeing? Do you think that actually the game is going to start effectively changing intrinsically what it is, simply on the basis of the introduction of VAR?
Completely, yeah, I do think that, because I think the laws were fine up until 2 years ago. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't remember 2 years ago there being debates as to whether the laws were okay. But as soon as by introducing technology and, slow-mo and Hawkeye and all these things, you ask new questions of the laws which have never been asked before. It would seem ridiculous in the old days to say, but what about if an armpit is offside? But now, every week we get Premier League games which are decided by whether or not an armpit is offside. So I think the introduction of technology has asked new questions of the offside law. Handball is another good example. So maybe I've got rose-tinted spectacles, but in the past, I think people generally knew, on an instinctive level, what was and wasn't a handball. But what we've seen in the last few years with VAR is that things which in the past would not have been handballs have been given as handballs, because when you watch something over and over again on VAR, it looks more intentional than it is, and movements that happen in the course of playing football suddenly look like deliberate arm movements to block the ball. And I think what we've seen, particularly in UEFA competitions, because remember different competitions use VAR differently, but in UEFA competitions it is increasingly the case that any touch by a player's hand is given as a handball. Now, that is a radical change in how football works. But I feel like the more technology we use, the momentum is towards every hand touch of the ball being given as a handball. That is the direction that the sport is heading in. Because, we can judge them all objectively by the camera, and it kind of is assumed to benefit attacking play. I just feel like that is the momentum of the game. And I think that's wrong, basically, because I think the rules were fine as they are. But clearly, the introduction of technology has had a really destabilising or disruptive effect on the laws. And I think ultimately the technology will stay and the laws will change.
So how do you see the future rulemaking going in light of this then?
Regardless of whether or not the Wenger proposal goes through, I wouldn't be surprised if we see future changes to particularly offside and handball. I think they're the two issues which have been most disrupted by the introduction of technology. The problem with this is that IFAB have responsibility for the whole of football. Competitions cannot opt in and out of certain laws, although they can give guidance to referees on how this sort of thing should be used. And that's why we see a slight divergence in the offside or handball approach between, say, UEFA competitions and domestic competitions. But what it means is that non-league football, lower league football, football at all levels all around the world, for all genders and standards, this is getting dragged along by the complaints of the 20 Premier League teams and the fans of those teams, the Champions League, the World Cup. And while that is obviously like the most important part of football by any measure, it's also a really small part of football. And it seems to me kind of, I guess, morally wrong and also like really impractical to have the laws of all football changed because of the very, very specific technological issues with a certain refereeing process, namely VAR, which only affects like a microscopic top of the game. It's like the kind of 0.001% of all football that is played is refereed by VAR, and yet VAR is going to mean we change the laws, which means that your local non-league team, all their linesmen are going to have to reinterpret what they judge to be an offside. The unfair distorting effect of that strikes me as being like a big problem, and also completely inseparable from the bigger questions about inequality in the game and the fact that football at the top level is just astonishingly different from most football that is played around the world.
You can read all of Jack Pitt-Brooke's writing and listen to his View from the Lane podcast over at The Athletic. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not rate and review it on iTunes or share an episode with a friend. See you next time.